a fire notice. Thank you very much.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Fire notice first. I'm afraid it's very straightforward in this building. Go down the main staircase, go out of the front door, turn right, and wait in Abchurch Yard until someone comes and with a register to check that you're out there. If you're in the lift at the time that the fire alarm goes off, it will take you to the ground floor and then it won't operate. So down the stairs, out the front door, turn right. We have 97 members and fellows here today and 9 guests. We also apparently have 1 overseas visitor, but I can see 2 at the moment. So welcome to all of the overseas visitors here, particularly Bart and Julia. Oh, and we have some of our Chinese members as well. One last thing, another appeal for volunteers. Now that we're in our new building, we are desperate to get more people to help out to do things like cover the front of house, reception, etc. If any of you have any time to volunteer, if you could go and see David Taylor, our new man on reception, we would be very grateful. Just give him your contact details and let him know what you would be prepared to do, and he will be in touch again. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, John. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure to welcome Hugh to his presentation of US mail by rail. It's well known in the philatelic world. It's been exhibited on a number of occasions, but he's accompanying it today with a PowerPoint presentation, which I know will enhance the display that you have seen downstairs. Hugh, it's a great pleasure to invite you to do your presentation now. Thank you.
Thank you. Fellow members and guests, Mr. President, and others. Jason, it's not on. 1, 2, 3. It's on. Right. I'll start again. Fellow fellows, fellow members and guests, thank you for inviting me to give this presentation. I've been studying US mail contracts for a few years now, and this I was told I was the guinea pig for this, so it's... So where did the collection come from? Between 2004 and 2006, I spent 8 weeks in Washington, D.C., and was studying contracts to carry mail by water in America, and I imaged about 2,500 records of contract information from the post office records, which are housed at the National Archives, which is the large building you can see there in the picture. That's 17 floors, of which 13 are the stack. So it's a fairly significant amount of material in there, not all of it post office. And that resulted, well, in fact, my first book on postal history was related to London letter receivers. Some of you I know actually use it, which is amazing. After London 2000, I decided to move my study across the Atlantic. I didn't choose another country because, as in the words of Bernard Shaw, America and England, or Britain, are 2 countries separated by a common language. They spell things differently and they pronounce things differently, but we understand each other, and at least I can read their writing. So I did this work on the routes by water, and that ended up in a book, and I got 3 large gold medals for my exhibit. After 2010, I decided that I wanted a different subject. And I found in my collection of American material a railroad cover, which I didn't realise I had. And I'll come back to it later. But I realised that I'd seen a lot of information about railroad contracts at NARA, at National Archives, and I could go and see what I could find there. Up until that point, there had been really 3 students of TPOs in America, serious ones. The first one was back in the 1920s, a guy called Dr. Carroll Chase, who's quite famous for the 3-cent American stamp of 1851 through to 1857. A guy called Chuck Remley, who made a study of railroad covers, and more recently, Charles Towle, who built up a very big collection and wrote quite a number of books on railroads. But one of the things that was missing from all of this was who were the contractors? Well, obviously, you'd say the railroads, but there was nothing in any of these books about what service they provided, how much they were paid for the job. And I thought, well, that's a bit of missing information, and I love a challenge. So off I went for another 7 weeks to Washington, not all at once, over a period of time. And first of all, built up a collection, and then started putting all the information that I had obtained from the archives together. The exhibit itself takes a fairly standard form that I've been using since the mid-1980s, and that is cover, few words, and quite often illustrated with a map showing the route, or from the London book, the location of the receiving house. I think maps are important. They put everything in context. Mind you, at that time, in the mid-80s, the judges didn't like that. So I've used the same format in all my exhibits. Obviously, in the case of railroads in the USA, it's a pretty big place. So how do you display such a big area, even if I'm only taking 40-odd years? And I decided that it needed to be split into chapters, so I present it as 8 different chapters. And you can see here that it starts with chapters 1 and 2 just based on short lines. They carried a phenomenal amount of material, Washington to New York via Baltimore, and the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, which went from Baltimore to Wheeling on the Ohio River. And then areas like the West Coast, which didn't come into play, of course, as far as railroads are concerned, until the late 1850s. Got an illustration here of the red line is simply the total mileage of railroads that were put into operation in each of the years from 1832 to 1878, and the contract miles that the Post Office Department contracted for the carriage of the mails, and then sub-split into these regions. And you can see, as far as the West Coast is concerned, nothing happened until you get to basically the 1868, virtually nothing at all. And then you start getting things like the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific Railroad and other railroads in the West Coast. So, the first chapter, it's Washington via Baltimore and Philadelphia to New York, and obviously a very important route. New York, the commercial center of America, Washington, the political center. So the amount of mails going between the two were phenomenal. And you start to get contracts in the 1830s carrying mail, but initially not by the railroads. The mails were carried by coach companies, mail coach companies, who, when they were available, then started to use the railroads to carry the mail. And as we go through, you'll see this a recurring theme. No contracts were made with any railroads until 1836. And after 1836, all of the railroads started to get contracts, or most of them started to get. And that's because in 1838, federal government passed an act which said all railroads were to be deemed mail routes. And supposedly all railroad companies were required to carry mails, but that didn't happen. A lot of the railroad companies wanted far too much money to carry the mails, and the Post Office Department had a limit as to how much they could spend per mile for the carriage of mails. The cover that you see there is one of the very earliest to have a CDS. That was the Baltimore Railroad. The cover that I've got is January the 11th, 1839. I'm told that there is one earlier. I've never seen it. And the gentleman that claims to have it hasn't provided me with an image of it. I suspect it doesn't exist. But, okay. It's a bit of one-upmanship going on there, I think. The top cover is what happened before they had circular date stamps. And you can see it's simply got Balto Railroad, can't read it, from April 2nd, and that was a cover of in 1838. So it was a contract mail, but it was signed off like that by the route agent. The route agent accompanied the mail basically in the baggage car initially. They didn't have railway post offices. They used a table in the baggage car to sort mail and to take in way covers. Here's a little interesting wrinkle. Mails from New York going into Philadelphia. Philadelphia had a hand stamp which was NY. They're quite rare, and they were applied when the mails came out of the pouch from New York to the Philadelphia office. And then they applied that NY stamp, and if it was not a franked cover, then a charge stamp, which is the 5 cents at this time. The top cover is franked with a New York provisional. New York provisionals weren't supposed to be used and applied to letters that were posted outside New York, apart from a couple of arrangements. One was with Boston. They could only be used by applying it in New York and putting it on the letter in New York and posting it in New York. This letter obviously went to Jersey City on the ferry from New York, so just across the Hudson River, went down to Philadelphia in the pouch. At Philadelphia, they said, it's got New York provisionals on it. They were issued in 1845. We'll disallow that. And they charged it 10 cents, double rate, when it went back up the line to Trenton, because it came in the bag all the way to Philadelphia and then went north again to Trenton. So that's a little wrinkle. 1847, the first definitive postage stamps were issued, 5 cents and 10 cent stamps, otherwise known as Scott 1 for the 5 cent and Scott 2 for the 10 cent, one with Benjamin Franklin on it and the other with George Washington, as you can see. And you start to get them used on railroad covers. And here you can see the top one bears the Baltimore Railroad CDS, and the bottom one is, for a railroad cover, quite rare, Wilmington Railroad. It's on the same line, They were just the stations on the line, but they were called the Wilmington Railroad and the Baltimore Railroad and the Philadelphia Railroad. In fact, it was all one railroad. It was the Philadelphia, Baltimore and Wilmington Railroad. And there you've got a letter that went from Philadelphia to Baltimore. Only 2 letters are known with the Wilmington CDS on it, bearing a 5-cent Franklin. The really first major railroad, a reasonable length, was the Baltimore and Ohio. It opened up in 1832, 60 miles from Baltimore to Franklin, the first part of what became Baltimore to Wheeling. And at that, in 1832, the contractor on the road used the railroad to carry the mail for the first 60 miles. It then became, obviously, a major route to the west. Stockton and Stokes were the contractor, and they ended up with a very big argument with the Postmaster General, and the Supreme Court overruled the Postmaster General, and Stockton and Stokes were back paid $120,000 for 4 years of mail carriage for which they'd not received a cent over that 4 years. The other interesting thing about the Baltimore and Ohio is that you start to see quite a number of station agent hand stamps, date stamps, applied to covers put into stations on the line. And these were applied by what were called station agents. These were men who were employed by the railroad, not by the post office. They had to be at the station half an hour before the scheduled arrival and had to stay there half an hour after the departure of the train. And their job was, first of all, to sell tickets. Secondly, to look after the movement of the freight on and off the train. But they also sold stamps and took in letters. Now, they weren't post office employees, they were railroad employees. One of the things about this was it was only in the rules, it was only post office employees that could frank stamps. But what you see is in this example, the Monrovia on that bottom cover, they didn't follow that instruction, these station agents. Some of them might have been postmasters, but the majority weren't employees of the post office. But they ignored this instruction and they franked stamps, as you can see. One of the important sections of the line was between Washington and Baltimore, and you have 2 covers that went on that 40-mile stretch of line. One bears the wording Washington Railroad. Oh, lovely, thank you. And the other, Washington Branch Railroad. The Washington Branch Railroad is quite a rare date stamp. Chapter 3 is Pennsylvania and New Jersey. There's some nice little railroads in this area. The Philadelphia and Columbia, which was an early railroad, and that used 2 different stamps. You can see one which says Philada and Columbia, and the other is Phila and Cole. So 2 separate hand stamps on the same line and used contemporaneously. So obviously in a line where there were, for example, in this case, at least 2 trains a day, there were 2 route agents employed, 1 on each train. Hempfield, a little line that no one would have ever heard of. It's very short, 32.5 miles, goes from Wheeling on the Ohio River to a place called Washington in Washington County, Pennsylvania. Not Pennsylvania, West Virginia as it is now, Virginia as it was then. And Charles Towell recorded one which was sold at a sale of a large number of railroad covers in 1977, which Towell bought. These are two more. Now, Towell rated it as unique because he'd only ever seen one. Well, here we are, two others. So it's amazing what crawls out of the woodwork. Travel a bit further north up into New York. We come to, again, one of the early railroads, the Mohawk and Hudson Railroad. This was opened in 1836 and completed through and contracted the mails for July 1837. Now, initially on covers that went on the railroad, you just get an annotation, either RR or railroad, as you can see on these two covers. What's intriguing is that I suspect that those were applied when they got to Utica. I think it was probably the postmaster at Utica who put them on the cover. So just to identify that the envelope had come into Utica via railroad. I can't think of any other purpose for it. There was no difference in charge for the letter, although he seemed to be kind to some customers because he undercharged letters quite frequently. We then come to quite early use of railroad indicators. You can see the cover on the top, very small. It's like an old John Bull set. Railroad and then Utica. So these were carried from, in the top case, from the west through to from Utica through to Geneseo, which is Geneseo, which is about 180 miles west of Utica, and the bottom one was carried through to Schoharie, which is on the railroad between Albany and Buffalo, and then redirected. Albany to Buffalo Express Mail. Most of you will have heard of Harnden, hopefully. Harnden was an express carrier. He set up in 1840 as an expressman basically to carry parcels and other valuable items from Boston to New York. And he was contracted by the post office to actually to act as an agent, a route agent, to carry the pouches from Boston down to Stonington and on the steamboat from Stonington along Long Island Sound to New York. And he had that contract until his death in 1845. And the post office took over the people who were actually carrying the pouches and took them on as post office employees when he died. And you can see there a nice clear USA Express Mail. They used this description to try and fend off the other express mail companies who were basically eating their lunch. US Post Office Department had a monopoly, just as the Royal Mail had a monopoly. But it was substantially ignored over some years and the post office was losing revenue. So he tried to get this back by implying that the mail went quicker by them. It didn't, in fact. Quite often it went slower, but that's by the by. Interesting one. In 1864, the US Post Office started introducing RPOs, railway post offices, where they actually sorted the mail on the car between the termini. They'd done it for about 9 months in 1862, but that got interrupted by the Civil War. And in this case, in 1869, George Bangs was appointed to look after the RPOs. And in 1875, he had the idea of speeding the mails by putting them on a train made up entirely of RPO cars. And I'm going too slow now. I've got to speed up. So here's an example of a letter that was carried on the RPO car running New York to Chicago or Chicago to New York. And this went all the way from New York to Chicago. Interesting, 27 hours, 40 minutes to do the 978 miles. More express mail, but this time Boston to New York, and again contracted initially to Hamden. He made quite a bit of money initially out of this game. Boston to Albany, that was over 2 separate routes, Boston to Worcester and then Worcester to Albany. Housatonic. For some reason the Americans love the Housatonic Railroad. I have no idea why, but they pay a fortune for covers that have gone on that line. And it wasn't a particularly important route of transport. Went through Connecticut State up into Massachusetts. But the Americans love these, so there's a couple of examples there. One is a station agent for Kent. Eastern Railroad, again, a cover with a 5-cent Franklin, and one with 2 3-cents, one of them perfed and the other imperfed, which is unusual. So 1851 issue and an 1857 issue on the same envelope. Someone must have squirreled away the 1851 stamp and decided to use it. Southern routes, Louisa Railroad opened up in 1849 to Charlottesville, which was of course the home of the University of Virginia. So we have a letter addressed to that university bearing the Louisa Railroad CDS, and the Richmond, Fredericksburg and Potomac Railroad, which went from basically Acquia Creek down to Richmond, and steamboat Acquia Creek up river, up the Potomac to Washington. That's the route. And you get a number of different cachets, Richmond Railroad, and later on one which simply says Potomac Postal Cars. It's the only line where that phrase is used for some reason best known to themselves. We go to New Orleans. It's an interesting one. A relatively short railroad, 82 miles in total, from Algiers, which is immediately opposite New Orleans, to Brescia. And when Charles Morgan bought the railroad in the late 1860s, he changed the name of the railroad to the Morgan Railroad. He was a big, but not only, he was a steamboat magnate, but he built steamboats, he built steam engines, but he also then owned railroads, and this is one of them. Top letter, they didn't have a route agent. The baggage master applied the cachet on the top letter. And the bottom letter is the only known example of a Tigerville station agent. Again, a new find. You can't do this without mentioning the Civil War, so I'll mention the Civil War. It's mentioned, here you are, you've got two letters, one bearing a Smyrna station agent's date stamp, and you've got in the period before the Civil War, so 1859. You come to May 1861, 31st of May. All the seceded states, the contracts in those states were cancelled for carriage of mails, so the Confederate Post Office took over the contracts. So you still get hand stamps used by the Confederacy. We go to the Midwest. Now this is unusual. Midwest didn't start really to be developed until well after the early 1860s, or sorry, the early 1850s. Therefore, to find a letter going in the Midwest with a first 1847 issue stamp is unusual. They're early contracts. There's another example on the Madison and Indianapolis line. Lovely little railway, Little Miami Railroad. It wasn't that little. And the bottom cover is an exceptional one. Tal rated it as extremely rare. That means there were 3 or less known at the time that he did his cataloguing, which was 1986. And here we have an example which he actually owned for the Little Miami Xenia Railroad, Ohio. That's what the little MXRRO stands for. Here's an interesting one. Letters carried on the Grand Trunk Railroad from a terminal at Port Huron on Lake Huron down to Detroit. And no one has come up with a reason for the railroad way marking. And there was some contention about this cover, but one of the major collectors in the States, Stanley Ashbrook, was firm that this was applied on the Grand Trunk Railroad. And I have the original letter to say so. Again, in the Midwest, the very first use of railroad post office cars. That's a 40-foot car, and I haven't got it in the exhibit, but that's a rather tatty envelope that was carried, I suspect, on that car. We'll flick through now because I think we're going to run out of time. Chicago Supplementary Mail. This is a little wrinkle. In Chicago, for about 2 years, they made an arrangement where you could take a letter to the post office half an hour after the office closed if it was going to the east and by train. And that obviously gave some advantage. And it was Chicago Supplementary Mail. It only lasted a couple of years, and they obviously decided that there was no extra fee. So what the post office got out of it was nothing. They just had the cost of having someone at the post office stay there to take in the letters and apply the CDS. We come to the West. Now there's not many railroad covers before the late 1860s for the West. Very few, for obvious reasons, because the golden spike was not put in place at Promontory Point until May 10th, 1869, when the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific met to form what was then the line from Omaha through to Sacramento. This is very unusual. It's the only one I've ever seen, and it's obviously a station agent stamp. It's Sacramento, and it's the Sacramento Valley Railroad. Not reported anywhere. Well, until now. So there you've got your Central Pacific. I'm afraid I don't have a 10th of May cover. I only know one, and that's George Kramer's got it. And I would imagine he'll hold on to it until he's dead. And I wouldn't be able to afford it anyway. The Union Pacific, it's rather a nice RPO cover because it's got a 12 centre on it. And you can see the reason being that it's addressed to Edinburgh. So it's the 12-cent transatlantic rate that was applied using the 1869 issue stamp. That was very short-lived. 1869 issue, which was a pictorial issue, the first pictorial issue that America did, was very unpopular with the public. So they withdrew it by July 1870. So I think they missed out there. So I think it's a beautiful issue of the stamp. Another little wrinkle, you've got covers bearing the hand stamp terminus. Now there isn't a place called, well there are places called terminus, but this didn't apply to a place. It was actually the mail car on the train, and it was during the construction of the railroad. And in this case, the top one is for the Southern Pacific Railroad, which went from Yuma through to Tucson, so in Arizona, so it's Terminus, Arizona. And the bottom one was applied on a cover which was in Montana. So this was a railroad being taken north from I haven't got it. North from, I can't remember the place now, it's downstairs, to the railhead. So these covers were actually carried to the railhead and then onward by coach or horse, quite possibly, during the construction of these railroads. And you only find them on these two railroads. There's one other which is on the bottom one, which says Idaho. So you've either got Terminus Idaho or Terminus Montana, but they were both used on the Utah and Northern. And finally, you've got two frames of ephemera. I love ephemera, and I think a lot of other postal historians do as well, because they tell you a lot. You've got an original contract there. You've got a law, an enacting law to have the New York and Hudson Railroad built through the city of New York from downtown, which was sort of 18th Street, running along the road. Didn't have a separate railway line. The rails were like tramways, just built into the road surface. So people got knocked down, of course, and which meant that they had to amend the law, and they could only run from 42nd Street, where 42nd Street, the Grand Central Station is, and finally, envelopes advertising one of the famous what became the Pullman cars, which were manufactured in Alton by Mr. Pullman. And the bottom was a nice use of an image of a railway engine and train as a printing press from a Chicago Daily Times. And from all that research came a book which, I'm sure some of you know, got the Crawford Medal and a large gold at Stockholm, and is available from myself. At a price £20 lower than I've put on the back of the handout, mainly because I can't do math, as the Americans say. And with that, I finish. Thank you.
thank you very much indeed for that erudite exposition of US mail by rail. Very much a challenge, I'm sure. May I now call upon Richard Wheatley to present the vote of thanks. Richard. I think he's switched on.
Thank you, Mr. President. No, it's not switched.
Well, it was, and I haven't played it.
Is it? It is, yes.
Loud and clear.
Mr. President, fellows, members, friends, Hugh, gives me great pleasure to present this vote of thanks. And before I came here, I had a look at Lindekin. I think that's how you pronounce it. And Hugh's name appears there. And one of the things it tells me is that when he was studying at Watford, he did pure and applied physics. And when you hear that speech this evening and you look at the handbook, you can see what sort of brain power you've got there that's coming in that can give him a living, a good living, provide us with the enjoyment of these lovely covers and the text that goes with the handbook. It's quite remarkable, and you've done extremely well there, Hugh, extremely well, yes. I'm rather surprised, though, that when you finished with the GB, you set up Juniper auctions. Now you've just about finished with the railroads. I thought you'd have really got Juniper auctions up and running again, you know. But no. Anyway, those were good auctions many years ago. And you've got something, you've left this world with 3 glorious books, 2 of which have got the Crawford Medal. It's extremely good background is that to the talk we've had today. You had, towards the end of your talk, a particular oval cachet which said rail, road, and then way to the bottom. I think this may well be something to do with the railway itself, because in England, the railway, to a railwayman, is called a permanent way. And maybe that is the American equivalent of that. I've learnt a lot this afternoon, I think we all have. We've also had the most enjoyable display and talk. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Now comes the opportunity for anyone who has a question to ask it. Are there any questions? Yes, there's one. Oh. Dane, the gentleman at the back. First.
Was there a railroad building mania in the USA as there was in Britain in the 1840s and 50s?
Oh, it was even greater. And not only was it greater, but the railroad barons in America were nastier men than the ones over here. You know, the barons, a lot of them lost a lot of money, but they didn't. The shareholders lost a lot of money, the investors. The railroad barons usually made a lot of money out of other people's misfortune. But yes, there were shenanigans left, right and centre all over America and over quite a long period. Involving Cornelius Vanderbilt, Daniel Drew, Erastus Corning, a whole load of what were also called the robber barons. So yes.
John.
Hugh, you mentioned the Civil War very briefly. Was the carriage of mail completely disrupted by the Civil War, or did letters and parcels get through across the lines?
No, letters got through under basically cartel arrangement or flag of truce arrangements. So there were exchanges of mails, but mainly, of course, they were prisoner of war mails. Normal commercial trade didn't. They got through by going via the Bahamas.
Right.
The blockade runners via Nassau, basically.
Any other questions? Peter?
Thank you. In your chapter 2, which was the Baltimore, Ohio Railway, I think you mentioned that there were 44 stations in 60 miles.
No. The total route was about 360 miles between Baltimore and Wheeling. And there was also a branch that went to Parkersburg, which was further south on the Ohio. There were 77 stations during the late 1850s through 1860s on that line. So 77, of which, until I found 4 additional unrecorded types, there were 44 known.
Right. I'm so sorry. Thank you very much for clarifying that.
But it's probable that some of the other stations also had station agent stamps that just never surfaced.
Yes, fair enough. No, I it was just sort of slightly on the London, Brighton and South Coast.
Any other questions? No? Thank you very much indeed. Fellows and members will know that for presentations, for displays during the sesquicentenary period, we have substituted for the plaque that we usually present, the sesquicentenary medal, and it gives me great pleasure, Hugh, to present not only the medal but also the certificate to you for this excellent presentation this afternoon and display.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I've now got a hat trick of them. I've got 3.
Take your badge off, yeah, and he wants to do some, it's got water on.
To get slightly closer together. Thank you.
Do you want us to kiss?
Well, might be an idea. Make them smile.
We'll shake hands in a minute.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Right. Our next meeting is on the 23rd of January in a fortnight's time, and that will be a 1 o'clock presentation, 762 pages, or that is 21 times 16 pages per frame. And we will have the pleasure of inviting Claire Scott to display her collection of Brunei. Now, there will also be, and this is an innovation, a PowerPoint presentation, and that will start at 4:45 in the afternoon, so that we do leave sufficient time for the refreshments and wine to refresh the inner person after the display and the presentation is over. Peter, is there anything you want to say at this stage about tomorrow's Royal?
Just to say, Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, that we have £30,000 over the Christmas break. Thank you very much indeed. And that in about 10 days' time, I shall be sending out a new appeal for 2020, particularly focusing on the auction that we're going to have during the 2020 week, and looking for some of those little items which are tucked away at the bottom of your shoe boxes, which you've forgotten all about, but which are worth quite a lot of money to the Royal.
Thank you, Peter. The material, the display will remain in the frames until 6:15 p.m. and you'll be pleased also to know that wine and snacks will be served in the members' lounge downstairs until 6:40 p.m. May I thank everyone for their attendance today. Thank Thank you very much indeed.